This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. The nation has a new, and perhaps its last, education secretary. It's Linda McMahon, better known to the world for her family's professional wrestling empire than any ties to public education. She was confirmed by Congress on a party line vote in early March. Now, as President Trump takes a sledgehammer to the U.S. Department of Education, what role will this new secretary play? How can education journalists more effectively cover this story and the countless ripple effects making their way to states, districts, and classrooms? Joining us to answer all of these questions is Linda Jacobson. She's a senior writer for the 74 Million and one of the nation's top education beat reporters. Linda, welcome to EWA Radio.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let's start at the top. Tell us a little bit about Linda McMahon's experience in public education, specifically in her home state of Connecticut.
Well, like you said, she did lead an empire, World Wrestling Entertainment, where she became a very wealthy woman and apparently, became interested in education when she saw that schools in her own community were not performing well and didn't understand it was a wealthy area. How could kids be below standards, and below grade level? And she apparently reached out to the local superintendent wanting to talk about, what she could do to help, was not welcomed, into the district. And so she calls the governor. So that's already, a sign that she had some friends in high places. So that apparently was sort of the beginning of her interest in education, and was not on there very long. So not much of a record to speak of, and left the board, ran for Congress, ran for the Senate twice and lost twice, and ended up in the first Trump administration as head of the Small Business Administration.
But what do we know about from her tenure there? What can we take away from there about maybe her leadership or management styles?
My understanding was one person I talked to in the business community said she was a quick study, that she got up to date on, you think of the irony, WWE is certainly not a small business, so she probably didn't have a lot in common with some of the constituents in that sector, but she was definitely focused at the time on the Trump tax cuts of 2017 and how those would benefit small business owners. That was kind of the core of her work. And I think there was some disaster relief around that time as well.
But her service was relatively free of, I would say, major brouhaha or scandals.
Correct. Yeah.
And now she's in the middle of what is arguably the most massive overhaul of any publicly funded federal agency, I think, that anybody can remember.
I agree with you there for sure.
Well, let's talk about what she has said her department's priorities are. And she put out a mission statement, if you will, and she called it the final mission. And jokes about, sounds like a bad Star Trek episode aside, but she laid out these priorities. So let's go through these. So she said she emphasized that in her department's view, parents are the primary decision makers about their children's education. I would think that most people would say that makes some logical sense, unless there's some reason why parents wouldn't be in a position to take care of their children.
Right. But we know what that means for Republicans. It means school choice. It means weighing in on curriculum decisions, library book decisions, that kind of parents' rights angle.
For sure. And then, the second prong of this is to, quote, ensure taxpayer-funded programs focus on core subjects rather than, quote unquote, divisive topics. And in talking specifically about diversity, equity, and inclusion, that, of course, has more controversy attached to it than this first prong.
For sure. For sure. And we've seen the actions that they have taken across the board to cancel contracts and fire staff that were at all connected with those types of programs.
But we've also seen some schools doing what some Democrats have called, quote unquote, obeying in advance, which, pulling things from libraries or from classroom instruction that may not have even been targeted yet.
Yeah, I think that is certainly the goal, to get districts and universities to to submit without being investigated or being called out. I do think we see the opposite as well, of some people pushing back and saying your directives are so vague that we don't feel we're doing anything illegal.
There's the third prong, which is actually something that for a long time has been fairly bipartisan in terms of the support that it's enjoyed, and that's to make post secondary education a pathway to good paying jobs. Can you talk a little bit about anything she's said or shared about how she's going to accomplish that?
I don't think we know a lot yet about how she wants to accomplish some of these things. She has talked about apprenticeships for sure. And I think certainly with her business with, SBA, that there's interest in how can we better merge K-12 and career education, but I don't think we know yet how she's going to put that into action.
There's been a lot of consternation, of course, about the massive layoffs at the Department of Education. I read in one story that the department is now half the size of what it was before President Trump returned to office, and how these things are going to get accomplished, if anything is going to get accomplished. We'd be remiss if we didn't mention that the bulk of what the Department of Education does isn't K 12, it's actually higher ed, things like processing student loans and Pell Grants and all of that money that goes to higher education. What have you been hearing from your sources in terms of, is everyone just in a wait and see mode right now? Or do you see some changes that are actually going to be visible and changing the way things happen in classrooms?
I think that there's a lot of questions over what assessment and accountability is going to look like under this secretary. Even the most plugged in assessment experts do not really have a grip yet on what kind of waivers are they going to approve. What will accountability look like? I mean, obviously, over time and with ESSA and certainly post pandemic, we've seen a rollback of strict accountability measures for low performing schools. And will the department, in its drive to take a very hands off approach, what is that going to look like? I don't think we know yet.
ESSA, of course, is the Every Student Succeeds Act, which replaced No Child Left Behind, which refers to the subtle changes and shifts and short term changes that happen with each new administration, periodically, I should say, to the backbone of the nation's education law, which is the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. But let's talk about that. We have that act and we have a Department of Education. Let me be devil's advocate here. Why do we need a Department of Education, Linda?
It was originally created really as a civil rights agency, and that has been one of its primary functions, to ensure that kids with disabilities, kids who are the most vulnerable, low income children, are getting an equal opportunity to have an education and to hold states accountable for the way they spend federal funds. And, we're seeing obviously some states pushing for fewer strings attached, and the administration certainly seems open to that. So what is that going to look like?
Well, you've written specifically about that, haven't you? About how states are responding to these developments. Tell us a little bit more about what you found.
I think they see an open door for sure. We haven't seen the whole process completed yet, so we don't know what McMahon is willing to sign off on. But will some of these be used as kind of a signal to how far they're willing to go? There's concerns that some of this stuff cannot be done without Congress reauthorizing the law or amending the law. But we've seen from this administration that that doesn't always matter. So,
Well, right, because I mean, we're also waiting to see what's going to be challenged, correct? I mean, the department can take these steps, the administration can take these steps, and then we're sort of bystanders here.
right. We're seeing, back on the DEI issue, the canceling the contracts over teacher preparation programs. It's already gone to the Supreme Court, so we may know soon whether they did violate the law.
Linda McMahon has stated that these changes to the Department of Education are going to eliminate red tape, and it'll just mean that these federal funds aren't going away. They're just going to get to states more quickly. But it's not just about speed, right? I mean, it's also, there's supposed to be some oversight and accountability embedded in how those federal funds are spent, and some kind of national priorities for what we expect schools to do. That's what ESSA is, right?
Right. And I think that talk of merging some of these funds into block grants A lot of governors and state chiefs will talk about, we want to be more innovative. We want to try these new things. But that money is also there to provide some stability for certain populations like homeless students and migrant students and English learners. And we haven't seen yet whether they will hold those amounts, consistent. What will happen if they gain more flexibility to spend this on their priorities.
We're talking with Linda Jacobson. She's a senior writer for the 74 Million about the big changes in the Department of Education with the arrival of new Education Secretary Linda McMahon. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And many thanks to everyone who's taken a moment to rate us on iTunes and the Apple Podcast Library. Your support and feedback are helping us to grow. Linda, I want to talk about a concept, and that concept is capacity. And I want to encourage education journalists who are listening to think about everything we're talking about here in the context of capacity. So, a few years back with the Common Core state standards, one of the big questions was, how are we going to test and measure that these standards are being applied and that students are learning to these new standards? And one of the questions was whether we should have these national tests that everyone uses the same one. And Linda, you remember they had one couple of states pushed back and said, no, we want to have our own state level tests. We're going to write our own tests for these standards. And state education departments said, okay, that's great. We don't have a psychometrician on staff. Who's going to write these tests? I mean, a lot of times you talk about things getting pushed back to the state, but then there isn't the capacity to get these things done. What do we know about state capacity right now? If all of this changes, if the federal government yields its authority and responsibility to the states, are states ready to take this on?
I think there's some big questions about that. I mean, certainly see some consistency with some state chiefs, but look at Virginia. They just lost another state superintendent, and there's other states like Tennessee where the state chief has been in some hot water with the legislature. They've called for her resignation. I mean, I with state departments, like with districts, there's been tremendous turnover since the pandemic, and I think there are a lot of questions over whether offloading some of these tasks down to the local level, down to the state level, how well it's going to go.
So is that a question local reporters should be asking of their state superintendents in those offices?
Yeah, it's not too soon to start saying, if this federal government is no longer telling you what to do with these funds, how are you, or lightening up the load in other ways, how is your state going to take it on? How are districts going to take it on?
There's another huge capacity question, and that's on something you mentioned earlier, and that's on school choice. So let's say that there is a massive expansive in these voucher programs, which allow taxpayer dollars to follow children into parochial private schools. Are there enough of those schools to serve all the students who want one? What do we know?
I don't know if anybody has tried to calculate something like that. I mean, we do see tremendous growth in smaller models like micro schools. There's still growth in the charter sector, maybe not, as much as there was before. But you are going to have, I mean, if you look at DC, for example, you've got the DC voucher program. You've got as many kids going to charters as you do the district schools. I mean, there's going to be more variety in the market for sure. And families now just kind of have an expectation of choice. It'll be interesting to see. One thing I'm definitely watching is whether this federal tax credit that has been proposed, and I think has gotten through a committee for the first time, will make it into the reconciliation bill that the Republicans are negotiating right now. And that would be a corporate tax credit for scholarships for families. And it would be the first national school choice program, really. So I think that's definitely something to watch.
I encourage our listeners to take a look at some of the fine reporting that's been done on voucher programs nationally, including recently a project by the Washington Post, which found that an estimated 90% of the voucher recipients were already in private and parochial school programs. They were not coming from public schools. Fine work has also been done by ProPublica and WFYI in Indianapolis, Eric Weddle for the PBS affiliate, looking at Indiana's private school voucher program, which has cost that state $500 million. I want to talk a little bit about where anybody may be seeing some positive light. Certainly, you interviewed school finance expert Rebecca Sibilia. She had previously co founded EdBuild, which was a nonprofit focused on inequities in school funding. And she suggested that there could be a benefit to somebody like Linda McMahon coming in with a microscope to really scrutinize federal school funding. Can you tell us more about that perspective?
Well, I don't think anybody would argue that there probably is duplication. There probably is some waste. I know one big section of the department that was eliminated were the staff that were focusing on ESSER funds. So it makes sense that those people would be phased out. I think right now it's kind of a rocky transition because there are states that are waiting for reimbursements on funds that they're still paying down and have not gotten them. I think things were happening just so quickly, that staff that people were depending on, aren't there. But yeah, I mean, I think things certainly could work more efficiently. They always can. It would be interesting to see where they target those efforts. I think there's concern though that what's not getting done as well.
Well, let's talk about who's going to feel that impact the most quickly. I mean, certainly in some states and some communities, people say they haven't noticed any changes yet, but that may just be because they're more insulated or they have all the teachers they need right now and they're not depending on those programs, the ones you mentioned, the pipeline programs that we're going to bring new teachers in. They may not be as dependent on those as some other communities. But who are the student groups that we should be most worried about right now?
I think anybody who had an open complaint with OCR, with the Office for Civil Rights, students with disabilities, students who have faced sexual harassment or abuse, a lot of those investigations, we understand, have just been stopped. I mean, we don't know where some of those cases stand. The administration has certainly indicated what its priorities are in terms of investigating discrimination. That's a big question of what do these people do? Do they have other routes to try to get their issues addressed?
What about moving special education to Health and Human Services? I know that's something that's been floated. Why would that be problematic?
Well, if you look at HHS, I mean, it is a massive agency. It's like over 80,000 employees compared to, the ed department, which was about 4,000. I think there's fears that it would just get lost and not be a priority. I think right now the law states that IDEA is the Individuals with Disabilities Act is administered through the Department of Ed. That's something that Congress would need to change.
So while we're waiting for Congress to make some of these decisions and also some of these challenges to sort of force their way through the courts, what should reporters be doing in the meantime? Where are some areas that they could be focusing their attention to write thoughtful, nuanced stories that help their audiences understand what's happening and what's at stake?
I think definitely looking at assessment and accountability in an individual state. Is your state looking to make changes? Does it want to take advantage of this sort of invitation to submit waivers? The concern about sets of districts maybe doing a different kind of assessment is that you can no longer compare school to school if you have different assessments. And I heard talk of from one state saying, "Oh, well, maybe we'll just sample students and not test every student." What does that mean for parents getting results on how their own kids are doing? I think definitely asking questions about, if you were to combine some federal funds into a block grant, how would you spend that differently than you're spending it now? If you want to spend more on something to be innovative, what are you spending less on? So I think those kinds of questions, especially in a red state, should start asking. I think in blue states, I think there's still a lot of pushback and they're already suing over these issues. So to continue to follow that.
I would also encourage education reporters to remember that the Department of Education is hardly the only federal agency that reaches into public schools or has an impact on school communities. Pay attention to what's happening with ICE, Immigration's Customs and Enforcement, crackdowns on undocumented Americans, as well as people here with legal visas, green cards, what we had previously considered protected status. That's affecting things like absentee rates, and public schools, which were already suffering, as we know, in the midst of the pandemic and in the wake of the pandemic. So pay attention to that. Don't be afraid to ask your superintendents, is this a sanctuary district? Did you go back and look at those old school board minutes from 5, 10 years ago to see whether that policy was put into place and whether it's being enforced? And then also pay attention to what's happening with USDA, the US Department of Agriculture. We're already hearing from our members about cuts to things like food banks, which support schools, those backpack programs where they send food home with kids so they have food over the weekend when schools are closed. And it's definitely not too early to start looking at summer nutrition programs and how those are going to change this coming summer in light of those cuts. I mean, even if the money is still sitting somewhere, Linda, they've cut a lot of the staff that oversaw those programs and made sure that the food got to those kids.
Yeah, I think that another place to keep watching is, of course, HHS and childcare and early childhood, Head Start. I know that there are a lot of concerns about just the future of Head Start. I mean, it's always been kind of a political football, and enrollment never recovered from the pandemic, families, keeping young kids out of programs. So I think they really feel a threat.
That's good advice too, Linda. Thank you. Linda, both you and I have seen new presidential administrations come and go. What has surprised you about this iteration?
I think just how quickly everything has happened. Everybody knew that it was gonna be a lot of change in store. I don't think anybody was prepared for how rapidly it's happened, and education reporters, I think, are just struggling to keep up. I mean, all of us, every day there's been something, like you said, some new bombshell, and some people say that's intentional to the sort of move fast and break things approach, so
Well, what advice do you have for a local reporter who might be struggling in that environment? Maybe help them refocus, reconnect with what their goal is.
yeah, I think that staying in touch with your local school districts, seeing what are the downstream effects, if there are any. Like you said, at the top, are they changing policies? Are they changing curriculum because they don't want to be targeted or called out for something that could run afoul of what, of the administration's policies? I think if they're not feeling the effects, that's good too, Find out what's going well in that district. I'm sure there's concerns about funding. I know layoffs are happening in certain parts of the country. Those are the things that really matter locally.
We're in a holding pattern right now in a lot of ways, right? Because as you said, there have been these massive changes, but there are also lots of things that have to work their way through the courts. And we're waiting to see if the people who have the capacity to stop these things or can make the argument that they should be stopped.
Yeah, I think that very early on, before McMahon was confirmed, there were a lot of questions and continue to be questions over who's really in charge. Is it the White House? Is it Doge, the Department of Government Efficiency that so quickly came in and fired people and canceled these grants, et cetera? Would McMahon come in and sort of state what her priorities were? And so far, there really seems to be no difference between what the top says and what she's articulating. So that's something we're waiting to see for sure.
I want to end a little bit, if we can, on a high note, which is that EWA National Seminar isn't so far away, just a couple of months. What are you looking forward to?
There's always such a great chance to meet in person reporters that you've read, their work that you've read. And even if you're hearing things you've already written about, getting to talk with those researchers in person, you can't replace that. It's just always a very valuable opportunity.
Well, we look forward to seeing you there, Linda. And if anyone in the audience is looking to join us in St. Louis, Missouri, we'll be there May 28th through the 31st. You can find out everything about EWA's 78th National Seminar on our website, ewa.org. Linda Jacobson is an award-winning senior writer for the 74, covering Congress, policy, courts, early education, and more. She joined us from her home in Atlanta. Linda, thank you for making time for EWA Radio.
Thank you for having me.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there is a story or a reporter you want to learn more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 77 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, take good care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.